This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hi, I'm Amol Rajan, and this is The Media Show from BBC Radio 4. Hello, we are on a grand tour today with our guests coming from two hemispheres and spending a lot of time travelling between them. Andy Wilman has been called the fourth wheel to the trio of Jeremy Clarkson, Richard Hammond and James May, but that rather understates his influence. As executive producer of Top Gear, Andy turned the show into one of the BBC's most successful exports. Then he took them to Amazon Prime Video with the grand tour. Andy, welcome to The Media Show.
Hi.
Is this your debut on The Media Show?
No, I did it once in 2016 when we just launched the Grand Tour.
Of course.
Yeah.
Now your ultimate boss, Jeff Bezos, once said that the deal to sign you was very, very, very expensive. What contact have you had with him since?
We've had an email from him, so I've got his email address. Shall I give that out?
Yeah, what is it? Is it jeff@amazon.com?
I can't say that because there'll be like an assassin will be delivered, prime delivery.
Is that what happens?
And then and then you're gone. So not next day.
Does he check up on his investment? I mean, he's the sort of guy who knows what happens to his money, I imagine. So does he make sure you're delivering a bang for his buck?
Well, I think probably with like any of those streaming services, you never get any figures. You don't get anything. You don't get any indication in terms of viewing figures. How are you doing? So all you do know is if you're number one streaming or you've done well, and if they don't shout at you, you presume you've done well, but you don't get much. And then we re-signed, so I'm figuring that's okay. That we've done something okay.
You don't get some conciliary that turns up and says Jeff is very happy with you.
No, we don't get that. Apart from that one email, which we've all kept.
Okay,
That's it.
What did it say?
Good luck. If you'd like delivery of shampoo and books and stuff like that, please contact.
All of that stuff. Okay, we're going to get into the Grand Tour in a big way shortly. Visiting from Australia, we have Mark Ryan. If you are a reporter, your ears ought to prick up at this point because Mark has over £50 million to invest in journalism, thanks to his role as Executive Director at the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas. Mark, welcome to the show. Who is Judith Neilson, and is she the saviour of journalism?
Well, she might try to be, I think. That's her objective. Judith is not that well known, even in Australia. To the extent she is known, it's for her art collection. She's built up one of the world's leading collections of contemporary Chinese art. So her main interests are art, architecture. But a couple of years ago, she decided she wanted to broaden her philanthropic activity and thought it might be a good idea to support quality journalism.
And she's given you $100 million Australian dollars to spend pretty much as you see fit, right?
Well, no, we have an independent board of wise people who help us make decisions about where to invest that money. But it's early days. We're only 1 year old. We have a board in place. We have a team of very good international advisors who also contribute to our deliberations. And we basically are setting out, as I said, to support quality journalism in whatever way we can. We have about 12 projects underway at the moment, which are collaborations with media of different types, so large legacy media organisations, but also new emerging ones, and small media organisations in remote communities. So,
okay, well, a lot of people listening to the show desperately want your money, and their ears are pricked up right now. So you should be conscious of that over the next 26 minutes, because a lot of people are going to be flooding you with applications straight after you come off air. You used to be a journalist yourself. Many of your fellow Australians will, of course, know you because you had a prominent role working for Paul Keating, the former Australian Prime Minister. He was a Labour figure. Is it fair to think of you as something of a bit of a Alistair Campbell figure in Australia in the late 90s?
I don't think I played the game as rough and tough as Alistair did. Some people might dispute that, but it was that kind of a role. It was an advisor, come press secretary type of role.
Do you know Alistair?
No, never met.
Okay, well, you were there when bushfires were raging, so we're going to talk to you a bit about Scott Morrison, the current Prime Minister's handling of that shortly. Latika Burke is here, I'm thrilled to say. She's a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, to Australian titles. Latika, you're based in London. What was the last story you filed for your editors at home?
Well, interestingly, it was a big spat on air with Piers Morgan, if you've heard of him. And actually, he was not the focus. It was Laura Tobin, meteorologist. So she presents the weather on ITV's Good Morning Britain. And they invited one of the climate denying or sceptic MPs in the government in Australia onto the program. basically to give him a bit of a dressing down about being a climate denier. Now, I think it suited everybody's purposes that this went viral. It certainly suited the MP in question, Craig Kelly, because the more he talks about people questioning the science of climate change, I'm not kidding, you should see his social media feeds. It just gets flooded with support and people saying, good on you, Craig, keep giving it to the conspiracy mainstream media, etc., etc. Of course, ITV did very well out of it. They've had a clip that's been watched millions of times. But the real star to me was Laura Tobin, who, when I interviewed her yesterday morning, I asked her if she thought it was insulting what this MP had said about her after this interview, which was that she was an ignorant pommy girl. Now, Laura's studied physics. She's a meteorologist. She's had a decade and more experience forecasting. And she actually just said, I don't care as long as it's contributing to the climate change debate.
Exactly. Well, the climate change debate in Australia is not like the climate change debate in other parts of the world for reasons we'll get onto. Just before we do that, I want to talk a bit about philanthropy as a way of funding journalism. What do you make of the Judith Neilson Institute? Is this something Australia needs?
Absolutely. And I think we'll probably get to this a bit later in this segment. But Australian journalism is largely dominated by two mastheads. One is my publication, the Sydney Morning Herald. The other dominant force, and the most dominant force in Australia, is the Murdoch media. And the Murdoch media has had a huge part in shaping a lot of the economic policies, a lot of how we talk about climate change, for instance. And so it has come to probably have a disproportionate role in the public debate in Australia. But quite aside from that, philosophically, it's good to have more competition in the media sector. One of my great distresses is that I started my career as a radio journalist at, 19 years old, walking in, asking for a work experience, and I got a job that way. That radio station now syndicates a Sydney radio station. And that means my country town where I grew up is not getting its local news. And I think that that's a huge part that's contributing to the disaffection between people in their communities and the regions and the metropolitan areas.
So, Mark, is it fair to say, paint us a picture. You used to work as a journalist. You worked for local titles before. You worked briefly for part of the Murdoch media, didn't you, before you went into politics? Is that right?
No, it wasn't owned by the Murdochs when I worked there, no.
OK, but just paint us a picture of Australian media. It's a lot more staid, it's a lot more narrow in a sense than UK media, which is vociferous and loud and a bit crazy.
They try. The Murdoch tabloids in both Sydney and Melbourne, I think, can hold their own against most tabloids around the world. But Latika's right. News Corporation controls, I think it's roughly 70% of Australia's media, one way or another. And that's why I think it is important that an institute like ours comes along and somebody like Judith Neilson makes this kind of investment, because it will lead, I think, over time to greater plurality, more journalists. A lot of the projects that we've already started, for example, have created new positions for journalists where they did not exist before.
OK, so you want to shake things up in Australia. Just for the many, many people listening to this thinking, I want some of this man's money, do you invest in projects that are outside of Australia?
We do. We will do. In fact, one of the big projects that we hope to launch this year is called Asian Stories. And the idea here is to create a platform for the long term. So I'm talking about a decade or two. To create a platform to create more collaborations in the wider Asian region and involve Australian media in that as well, get more peer-to-peer exchanges happening between newsrooms in the region, and also just to try and shine more of a global spotlight on Asia. Everybody, I think, now accepts or realises that Asia is the centre of the world, economically, strategically, and will continue to be so. So to the extent that our institute can play a role in supporting more coverage, deeper analysis over time, will be a good thing.
OK, let's address the two obvious responses to people say that philanthropy is a way of funding journalism. You'll be familiar with these. One is that people say this is just a way of promoting the worldview of a very rich individual, and there's no guarantee of independence. What do you say to that?
Well, as I said earlier, we have an independent board. Our patron, Judith Neilson, plays no role in the Institute. So she's providing the funding, but has no role at all, either at board level or in the day-to-day operations of the Institute. A
bit like Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. If profit is the best guarantee of independence, though, isn't there a danger in any journalistic outfit that's dependent ultimately on philanthropy?
Well, I think the future for journalism, in a nutshell, is hybrids. I think that there will be many different kinds of models emerge over the next decade or so. Some will continue to be pure play commercial operations. There will be people who can make a living out of journalism, but equally there'll be plenty that can't. And so I think there'll be a mixture of commercial working with philanthropists, and in some countries like Australia with government as well, where there are taxpayer-funded media ventures. So I think it'll be a mix of all of these things, and it will depend on the given market and the format, the platform of media that we're talking about. So, I think that's why we've come onto the scene at the right time in Australia, where there is a lot of volatility and there is now an appetite for collaboration within the media industry that didn't exist a few years ago.
OK, well, Australia's very sadly in the news this week because we've all seen these horrific pictures of the bushfires, and I hope you guys don't have family that been adversely affected by it. A big talking point in terms of the media has been the Prime Minister Scott Morrison's handling of this crisis. You worked for an Australian Prime Minister who handled many crises, including bushfire ones. How would you characterise Scott Morrison's PR handling of this?
Well, I think most people agree it's been clumsy at best. But more than that, I think it's puzzled a lot of political watchers, because if anybody would be attuned to handling this crisis well, we would have thought it would be Scott Morrison, a former marketing guy, somebody who prides himself on having his finger on the pulse of the common man, as it were. So it's puzzled a lot of people that he went on holiday to Hawaii in the first place, but it's puzzled them even more that since his return, almost on a daily basis, he's compounded the problem. And I think he's ended up in the place that you never want to be as a politician, and that's playing catch-up. So every gesture that he tries to make now is viewed through a very sceptical and cynical lens. And so I don't know what the circuit breaker is, but he needs one.
And yet there is an extraordinary incongruity, gulf between the way newspapers are reporting what he's doing in Australia and what's happening on social media. Let's hear a clip that went viral this week of Scott Morrison. This is the moment he visited the town of Cobargo in New South Wales last week and tried to shake hands with some locals.
How come we only had 4 trucks to defend our town? Because our town doesn't have a lot of money, but we have hearts of gold, Mr Prime Minister.
No, you're an idiot, mate. You really
are.
You won't be getting any votes down here, buddy. You're an idiot. Who votes Liberal around here? Nobody. No Liberal votes. You're out, son. You are out.
Latika, the irony is, as Mark says, that Morrison himself is something of a former sort of PR man. There does seem this huge disconnect, doesn't there, between social media, which is quite anti-him, and I've been looking at the front pages. You don't see much of the same scepticism that people are seeing on social media.
Well, it depends which front pages you're looking at. The News Corp publications are heavily backing Scott Morrison. He is their man. He engineered a shock victory in May. Nobody expected it. News Corp said all along that he could win it. They've been vindicated and they feel like they have a lot of stake in this guy and they feel like they have a lot of stake in him doing well. So he enjoys very good relationships with the Murdoch press. So there's been some laughable kind of copy written in The Australian, for example, their broadsheet, where they were writing up his perceived difficulties or his perceived clumsy management. I mean, on every objective measure, Scott Morrison and his team himself would admit he did not handle this well.
And he's notorious for his views on climate change. He took a lump of coal into Parliament. You mentioned the dominance of particular groups within Australian media and how it's affected the climate change debate. What is the tenor of climate change coverage in Australian newspapers?
The best way to think about the way climate change exists in Australia as an issue is to simply substitute the word Brexit for climate change, and you pretty much got the same dynamic at play. So you have a hard right wing in the governing coalition, that's the Liberal National Party, and that is filled with sceptics and deniers, and they do not want Australia to be compromising its industry. I mean, we are a fossil fuel reliant economy. We have been for many decades. We've enjoyed uninterrupted prosperity and economic growth because of it largely. So they say there's no way we would throw out these key industries that give us our wonderful living standards for the sake of some symbolism. Now, on the other side, you have people who are saying Australia is a laggard. We're not doing enough. We could have been, fostering renewables, solar, wind, all of it, but we've done nothing for about a decade. And so this has opened up a huge split in the community where now it is not talked about as an economic proposition anymore. It is talked about purely as a cultural one. And so the bushfires have taken grip here because you have people saying, well, this is the climate change that we were told about 10 years ago. Here are those mega bushfires that reports in 2008 were predicting. And then on the right, they have these engineered campaigns to say, well, no, they were caused by arsonists, so it's just any old bushfire.
Right.
So, no, it's a land clearing management. The Greenies are trying to stop us doing backburning.
So, Mark, is one of the aims that you've got and Judith Nielsen's got to bridge that divide?
Well, to try to, but look, I don't necessarily buy all of the criticism of News Corporation. I mean, I take a longer view of News Corporation and look at what it's done for journalism over 60 years. There have been some spectacular missteps, of course, and they can and do get political, but that's their right. They're a media organisation. I look at what News Corp has brought to the Australian journalism community, and I think there's much more on the right side of that ledger than the wrong side.
One of your directors is the editor at large of News Corp Titles.
Yeah, a guy called Paul Kelly. I mean, he's also a former editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, and probably one of our, if not our leading and most highly respected journalist is on our board. Yeah.
All right, it's good to hear from you guys about Australia, and it's amazing how global these issues are, because another chap who works for News Corp Titles and has views on climate change is Andy Wilman's school friend Jeremy Clarkson. Now, Andy, is it true that Jeremy Clarkson, in what I thought was something of a promotional gambit in a recent newspaper, said that he's changed his views about climate change, has he?
I don't think Attenborough needs to think I haven't got a job anymore. You know, he's like, we went to film our latest big film in the Mekong, and we came across right in front of our eyes a sort of embodiment of climate change. We were in a lake that's supposed to be very deep and hundreds of miles across wide, and it was waist deep for 70 miles across.
Well, let me stop you right there, because this is the moment it happened.
Now, there are many ways we could get across this fascinating country. We could use horses or tuk-tuks or tractors. But Mr. Wilman decided we should meet at this very spot with 3 boats, and that hasn't gone down very well with my colleagues.
No, I'm from Birmingham, I don't ski and I don't do boats, end of.
I signed up for a car show.
Yes.
Not cookery, not restoring frescoes, and not boats.
Let's start with the logistics, Andy. What sort of risk assessment do you have to undertake before letting 3 multi-millionaires set sail in tropical waters?
It's got bigger because Richard Hammond keeps crashing, bumping into things and everything. So the risk assessment gets bigger. The premium goes up all the time.
Have you got huge insurance policies? Give us a sense of how big.
Mental.
How big?
I could make a special that we used to make on Top Gear for what we now pay on like insurance.
What sort of numbers are you talking? I've got no idea what's the scale you're talking about.
1, 2. What's the noughts when it goes into the hundreds? 5. Yeah.
500,000.
No. 5 noughts. It's in that area with the premiums now. I think that I'm going to get killed for that one because
that's fine.
I got that wrong. But I think it's that.
Is it ever genuinely dangerous for the 3 of them?
Yeah, it is. It is genuinely dangerous because they do their things. You know, we don't get a stuntman in. The end of that particular show, when they were out at sea and the weather turned really bad, there's nothing for them to do but endure and carry on because you can't go back. You know, you've only got to go forward.
But is there a sense in which the Grand Tour, more so than Top Gear, where the emphasis was even more so on sort of car reviews, the Grand Tour has a sort of scripted, structured reality of a kind that you wouldn't necessarily get away with at the BBC?
Scripted, structured reality. I don't see a big heap of difference between the specials we used to make at the BBC and the ones that we do now. If we got off on a 2-week sort of film like that, we'll take a sheet of A4 with some bullet points. You know, we know we're going to go down that river there. We know we're going to reveal something. We know we're going to go to a market or whatever. But beyond that, all the words are theirs. Everything that comes out of their mouths is what they make up on the spot. And, you know, talking drivel, there are no 3 better people, I think, on that front. They've been doing it for so long. Also, if you think back to our beginning with Top Gear, we had, where the BBC was fantastic, was they allowed that show to breathe and grow into its own skin organically. So those 3, you know, if you look back at the old Top Gears, it was probably 2 years before we found our feet and nobody minded. So all their interaction and banter became as close to off camera as on camera.
But do you think a show would get that sort of 2-year licence now?
No, I don't think it would.
Well, the new Top Gear hasn't. I mean, they changed presenters pretty fast, didn't they?
Yeah, and those guys now drop into a format which has already been established.
Whereas you built
we sort of found our own feet as we went along.
What can you do and what can you get away with on Amazon Prime Video that you couldn't get away with on the BBC? It's very extensive.
It's all. I mean, this is the thing. Everyone said when we signed up with Amazon, people go, "Oh, it must be great now. You've left the BBC. You can do what you like." And I used to sort of go, have you ever watched Top Gear? We were in the we're in the Daily Mail every week.
I think I meant to apologise. I'm so sorry if anyone was offended by that.
Well, I'll apologise as well.
You are a mate of Jeremy Clarkson, so
sorry,
to be
everybody.
expected. On Amazon Prime Video, there's lots of drinking, there's lots of swearing. Jeremy Clarkson's rude about Jeremy Corbyn. You couldn't get away with that at the Beeb, could you?
Yeah, we could, yeah. The compliance team here, David Jordan, they were fantastic. They were, I thought, the benchmark, because what they would say is, you know, don't worry about getting a complaint. It's just make sure you can defend yourself once you get one. So you've just got to look back at the hoo-ha we would cause in the papers. There's always, you know, the Daily Mail would be on our case all the time, the Mirror, the Star, whatever. And that was under the aegis of the BBC.
You don't make the same sort of hoo-ha now, do you? Do you think an Amazon Prime Video would make the sort of domestic hoo-ha in Britain? You've got a very different relationship with the British audience. Obviously, it's a very global thing.
Yes, it's a totally a different thing. If we sat in our studio every week on the Top Gear one and then talked about what was going on. So, like speed limits, I remember Jeremy talking about, you know, I hate people who brake on the motorways. And then he goes, in fact, I put snipers on the motorway bridges, and anybody who, like, brakes in the outside lane, shoot them. Well, next day, you can imagine the papers. It kicked off like you wouldn't believe. Now, that sort of stuff, there's no... Once we started to do a show that A, goes out a month after you've recorded it, and B, is primarily much more global, you start to get a bit less parochial in your things.
I read that you don't watch Top Gear these days, and I don't believe you. I think you have watched it, and
I can take a lie detector test or whatever you're doing.
Never watched it? What do you think of the new lineup?
I've never watched it because... I knew I'd get asked about it. One, it was upsetting. You know, it all ended. It didn't end well, so it was an upsetting thing. Two, I've got tons of friends who make it, who I work with for years, and I really wish them well, and I want to succeed. And if I didn't like it, I didn't want to be able to say anything. So I thought, well, just don't watch it. So partly it was like our baby. I don't want to watch someone else taking our baby for a walk around the park. And two, all our mates are there. So I just thought, right,
okay,
you know, I'll leave it.
The new series of Grand Tour,
God's honest truth.
The new series is different to the previous three, which you mentioned. So you're doing this series of specials as opposed to regular episodes.
Yeah.
Is that ultimately driven, do you think, by the fact that the data Amazon amasses on how people are viewing the show indicates that the adventure specials were the ones that were most popular? Is that a data-driven decision?
It's partly. I'll tell you how that comes about. It's like we thought, right, we've been doing 12 shows a year, and we've kind of been doing 12 shows a year for 18 years, if you look at it from our kind of perspective. So we thought, we want to keep the quality up. We've got to slow down a bit, you know, do fewer, keep up the quality. And we said, right, the easiest thing logically there is to do the specials, like do fewer shows but have an impact. And then when we went to Amazon, who, like all the streamers, are notoriously tight with their data, when we went and said, we're thinking of doing this, they went, interesting, yeah, because they always rate the most highly. So it's sort of, we suggested something, they agreed.
They do give you a little bit. They don't put any numbers on that. You don't know how.
But it's like drip, drip, drip.
Is that disconcerting for you?
Used to be, because I came from a world of 7-day live figures, overnights, you know, consolidated, all that.
Do you think they're right not to share? Wouldn't they get better?
I do now, because you never on a streaming platform are you going to get that kind of impact of an overnight figure. But, so everyone is going to go, oh no, that's gone off a cliff. But at the same time, those shows are sitting there now, accruing viewers. And it's steadily mounting. So you can never compete with a 7-day figure, which is a big announcement, you know.
Do you ever think about what Amazon's ultimate motivation in employing you is, which is that they're using your expertise and your popularity to tempt people to do more shopping for garden shears or AAA batteries, whatever it might be? Slightly weird concept for a TV producer, don't you think?
Well, yeah, we were in no doubt that we signed up to a corporation. And that's, you've got to remember, we came out of the BBC, where sort of commercialism is like there's an arm's length element to it. So we did look at all that. But we sort of, well, could you say we excused ourselves from it? Maybe. That we just went, right, well, we are, if Amazon is, you know, a football, we're like a tiny little pigment on it. We're nothing in those terms. So we'll just, you know, take our money and make a show for them.
But with the BBC, you and the presenters made lots of money out of the additional merchandising and the licensing around the world, around Top Gear. And working with Amazon obviously presents you, Amazon Prime Video obviously presents you with an opportunity that you wouldn't have had at the BBC, as you say, around product placement. Have you ever thought about asking car manufacturers to appear on the show?
Oh, God, no. We wouldn't do car manufacturers. Never.
Why? Compromises you.
Because you can't have anything sponsored by Volkswagen, and then we do a test of a Volkswagen Golf and go, what a great car, you're just dead in the water. So actually, when we did our contract with Amazon, there was we asked for editorial control was one, and we sign off the last show sort of thing, and two was all discussions about any product placement, but automotive was like massive red line through, and anything automotive related, because we'd be dead in the water, and everyone knows we're not in the poorhouse, so why would we go shoot ourselves in the foot by...
Do any of them try to stop? Because, people forget this started out as a car review show on the BBC. It was very much, it was journalistic, and Jeremy Clarkson himself was all of them were from a journalistic background.
True.
Do any of the big manufacturers try to stop you getting access to their cars and their material because they're scared of you?
Used to. We had some tussles in the old days. I think Jeremy had a big one with Toyota, and eventually they give up, they win. Ferrari, always tricky. They would try and stop you having stuff. But you just wait it out, because if we're journalists, that's the end of it. We're not there to sell their cars.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it was the circumstances by which you left the BBC were sad. Was it ever an option to stay at the BBC after Jeremy Clarkson was sacked?
No, not for me, because it wasn't because we went to school and we grew up as mates and all that sort of thing. It wasn't. There was friend loyalty, yeah, and that doesn't mean I was blind to anything going on, but there was friend loyalty. But I was very angry when I left, and I wasn't going to sit in that management environment anymore.
Why were you angry?
Because I think it was so clumsily handled. There was a lot of anger flying around. There was a lot of agendas flying around. So I wasn't going to sit around in that environment. And then B, what kind of show was I supposed to make? They were like, stay on and make Top Gear. Really? Was I going to do that? Was I going to make something with new people? That's just kill myself.
Very briefly, before I ask the same question to Latika and Mark to finish the show, has leaving the BBC changed how you think about the BBC's long-term future in terms of the viability of the licence fee?
So speaking as someone who's got a lot of affection for it, yes. But my opinion's changed just because I'm watching what's happening. I'm watching what my kids are doing. I think now... we grew up with the BBC being like fabric of the nation, voice of the nation. You go around this building now, most production companies or broadcasters have got what they make on the walls. We've got pictures of Wreath and, old grandees. So I think what they've got to do now is sort of stop saying we are auntie or we are the nation.
A different role.
Be a corporation.
Very, very quickly want to bring back Latika and Mark, because in Australia you've got the ABC, which is funded by a government payment.
I used to work for the ABC.
Yeah, is that a viable way is that a good way to be? Is that what the BBC should be looking at in terms of its future instead of a licence fee?
I think the licence fee is mad.
Licence fee is
mad. I find it incomprehensible as someone who lives here and moves here that you have to pay twice to watch the BBC.
Mark, briefly.
No, taxpayers should fund national broadcasters
instead of a licence fee.
Yeah. I think so. And
it's turned into the most pro-BBC media show we've ever had. Goodness me, didn't mean for that to happen. Why? Briefly, you've got 5 seconds.
Well, I think they play an important role. I don't think anybody seriously argues that they don't. And they do things that other media can't. And in fact, the bushfires are a fantastic example. The people who have rightly got most of the praise are the firefighters, but the national broadcaster, it's been their finest hour.
Thank you very much to all my guests, Andy Wilman, Mark Ryan and Latika Burke. See you all next week.